Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we're going to put together the rear axle of the Hercules hobby Actros. It should be interesting as it's a completely different assembly to the Tamiya axle. In the 12 to 17 bag we have the sub bag with all the gears and bearings for the axle. The leaf spring bag, just like the front, they're not riveted together, so we'll just leave them in the bag to one side until we need them. This bag has the shackle bits along with the axle shafts. And in the last bag we've got all the fixings. Right then, on to step 12, assembling the differential. We'll need the diff case, the big bevel gear, two 10x12 washers, although I'd be more inclined to call them shims, the star shaft or spider, two of the middle-sized bevel gears, four of the small bevel gears, and four M2x10 screws. We'll also need some grease to build up the diff. Some people like to glue the differentials on the single axle truck solid, and it's tempting, but I think I'd rather have a working diff. So for now we're going to use some more of the grease that came with the 3 Racing X reel. It's fairly sticky, so it'll help a bit when one of the rear wheels gets a bit light. We might end up changing it for something even thicker at some point in the future though. First we'll assemble the spider with the small bevel gears. We need to smear a little bit of grease on one of the stubs, then spin a gear on. Repeat 3 more times and it's ready to fit. Next are the medium bevel gears, one goes in the diff case and one fits inside the large bevel gear. We'll need to grease up the flat face on one of the bevel gears, then drop on one of the thin washers and follow that with some more grease. With it all nicely coated we can drop it into the large bevel gear. We can build up another washer grease sandwich on the other bevel gear and drop it down into the bottom of the diff case. To try and gum it up as much as possible, we're going to really try and fill it up with grease. We'll start by running some around the bevel gear in the diff case, giving it a nice thick coat. Next we drop the spider in with its bevel gears and give it a nice thick coat of grease too, putting some nice blobs between the gears. Before we fit the large bevel gear, we do need to apply a little bit of thread lock in the threaded holes in the case. We really don't need much, just a little bit on a cocktail stick and smear it around. Now the large bevel gear goes on and we can fit the 4 screws. Just like the Tamiya diffs, the small screws are rather delicate, so you need to make sure your screwdriver fits properly. It would be all too easy to slip and ruin the head. Okay, step 13 next, we're going to fit all the bits to one half of the axle. We'll need the axle case half that has the input shaft hole, and as you can see it looks a lot more realistic than the Tamiya one. For the metal bits we need the 2 big bearings and 4 small ones, the 17 tooth bevel gear, 4 5x8 washers, 5 large E-clips, a single 3x6 countersunk screw, and the 2 long axle shafts and the short input shaft. Right, the first thing to do is a bit of a quickie. We need to attach the bevel gear to the end of the input shaft. To make sure it's not going to fall apart, a little bit of thread lock in the thread at the end of the shaft is a rather good idea. Then we just slide the gear on and screw in the countersunk screw. Doing it up about as tight as you can by hand is more than good enough. If you get one with a slightly dodgy thread, you can stick the shaft in a soft-jawed vise to get a better grip. Just be really careful not to over-tighten the screw. Next we can pop 2 of the small bearings into the axle case. One goes in from the inside and one from the outside. You can use a small screwdriver to gently press the bearings in place if they're a bit unwilling. Because this model's mostly going to be used indoors where it's fairly clean and dry, I'm not going to add any grease. Usually for the off-road models I'd pack the space between the bearings just to help against water, but there's really not much point on this one. When the bearings are in, we can just pop the shaft in with the bevel gear on the inside. Then to hold it in, all we do is use one of the big E-clips. Next we've got the axle shafts. Now they both need a bearing, 2 E-clips and a washer fitting. But it's not all that clear where the washers are supposed to go. The list says we need 4 washers, but the diagram only seems to use 2, so we'll have to make it up as we go along and see how it all fits together. The diagram has us fit the 2 E-clips to each shaft with a bearing in between. The bearings will end up sliding all the way to the outside when it's fitted to the axle case. On either side of the differential we need to slide on one of the large bearings. They should fit without a fight as long as you press them on nice and straight. Next we can pop a washer on the inside end of the shafts and press them into the diff case. Now I did grease up the end of the shaft a bit so it slides in a bit easier, and I also applied a bit on the end of the diff around the bearing. The other shaft should also slide in just as easy, not forgetting its washer. We're still left with the other two washers though, that don't appear to have a home. The differential assembly can now drop into the axle case. The two small bearings slide all the way to the outside and drop into slots right at the ends of the axle. At first glance, it all looks like it fits rather nicely. However, in closer inspection we can see the washer isn't actually doing anything. And worse still, the E-clip is actually only bearing on a plastic web in the case. That's not going to last more than 5 minutes. We can pull the shaft out again and pull the inside E-clip off and move the washer to the inside. Now at least the E-clip is bearing on a steel washer rather than a plastic, so that's going to work. It's a similar story at the other end too. Putting a washer between the E-clips allows it to do something useful. And skipping ahead a bit, when the axle went together I did find it was rather stiff. There wasn't quite enough clearance for it to turn freely. I ended up replacing the washer with a 0.3mm steel shim. After that, the axle ran very nicely. Now it's worth keeping it in mind, they very nearly got the design right, you just have to be a bit careful when putting it all together. Step 14 now, closing up the axle. We will of course need the other half of the axle case, the drive cup, 10 M2x14s, an M3x3 grub screw, 4 M2 nuts, and 4 M2x5s. Now as you might imagine, it's all quite straightforward. First we can offer up the case and do a test fit. All we want to do is make sure it all lines up nicely and there's nothing obviously binding. If it's okay, we can go ahead and lather up the bevel gear with a nice bit of grease. A bit too much is better than not enough. Any excess is going to get squeezed out and flung off after a few minutes of running. Now we can put the halves together again and start fitting all the screws. There's a nice diagram showing the length of the screws around the pumpkin. The M2x5s are there just for show, making the amount of screw heads even around the edge. The M2x14s go all the way through and thread into the other half. It ends up looking rather nice indeed. Just watch out for over tightening the screws. The M2 threads going into plastic won't take much to strip. At the ends of the axle we have 4 hex-shaped holes for the nuts, and we use 4 more of the M2x14s to hold it all together. A tiny bit of thread lock probably wouldn't hurt while we're there too, just make sure you don't get any on the plastic. That just leaves the drive cup, where we need to add a dab of thread lock to the grub screw and thread it in a few turns into the cup. Line it up on the flat on the input shaft and sit it all the way down so it's in contact with the E-clip, then nip up the grub screw. And there we have a rather nice little axle. It definitely looks nicer than Tamiya's, but the fit of the parts is lacking. The Tamiya just falls together and you can't help but have a smooth running axle. The Hercules does need a bit of thought and fettling to make it run well. Step 15, fitting the leaf springs to the chassis. Just like the front set, the rivets aren't riveting anything, they're just loose in the bag. But thankfully, because of the way the axle mounts to the rear, it's a lot easier to assemble. Right, we're going to need the 2 main leaves and all the sub-leaves, 4 M3x20s, 2 M3x14 step screws, 4 M3 nylocks, 4 washers, 2 leaf collar Bs, 2 leaf collar As. Now they both look similar, but the diagrams are nice and clear. And we'll need 4 shackle plates. We'll also need a pair of plastic spacers, Q13s. The manual wants us to assemble the shackles on the leaf springs first, then attach it to the chassis. I think it's going to be easier though to mount it to the chassis first, so that's where we're going to start. We need one of the collar A's, the one with the flat end, and we pop a shackle plate over the end, followed by a Q13 and another plate. We then insert one of the long screws through the middle and offer it up to the hole at the top of the chassis extension, while at the same time holding one of the nylock nuts on the back. There's a hex-shaped hole for it, so we don't have to worry about getting a spanner in. We just need to hold it in so we don't push it out with the screw. When it's all done up, the shackle plate should spin completely freely on the collar. If they don't, find out why before moving on. Next we can install the leaf spring. Now I'm installing it on the top of the chassis so we have access to the shackle. This time we just use one of the step screws and a nylock nut. The instructions want us to use a step screw from the inside and put the nut on the outside, but I found it fits okay the other way around, and I think having the screw head on the outside just looks that bit nicer. When the screw's nipped up, it should, just like the other end of the shackle, move completely freely. The fixed end of the leaf spring uses a collar B and a couple of washers. We fit the first washer over the collar and insert it from the inside of the hole at the end of the leaf. Then we press the collar into the plastic mount we fitted to the chassis earlier. Fit another washer and insert one of the long screws. The screw threads into an M3 nylock we fitted to the cross member back in the first build video. All we need to do is nip up the screw and the spring is installed. If all has gone well, it should flex smoothly without catching. If it binds on anything, fix it now rather than waiting. And of course there's another one to install, but it's exactly the same process, so we'll just cut it in. Very nice. Step 16, hanging the axle. This time we need 4 M3x27s, 4 M3 plain nuts, and the left and right damper mounts. There's also 2 C10s and 2 C18s that make up the axle mount. Starting on the top of the leaf spring, which is the underside here as the chassis is upside down, we need to hold a C18 under the leaf. Then carefully stack up the shorter leaves to make a pack and pop a C10 on the top. Now while holding all that lot together, because I forgot to get the axle ready, we need to fit the appropriate sided damper mount to the axle and push in the long screws to keep it all in position. Now we can offer up the axle to the spring and pass the long screws right through the mounts and leaf pack. Now it might need a bit of a jiggle to get all the screws through all the holes in the leaves, but as long as they're somewhere near lined up, they should go through easily enough. While still holding it all together, we can thread 2 of the nuts on the end of the screws. There are hex-shaped holes in the C18 mounts, so once a nut finds its way in, it's just a case of nipping up the screws. The other side is of course exactly the same, so rather than repeat myself, we'll just cut to it being complete. The only other thing we might want to add is a little bit of thread lock to the screws, just to make sure they can't vibrate loose. And there we go, one well hung axle. It feels nice and smooth in terms of the springing. I'm quite impressed. Step 17, the dampers. We'll need the 4 damper collars, 2 M3x12s, 2 M3x10s, 2 M3 flange nuts, and 2 non-damping dampers. There really shouldn't be much to this one. First, the top of the damper needs to be screwed to the cross member we fitted the press nuts to in the first video. We've still got the screws fitted that pull the press nuts into position, so they'll need to come out first. Now all we do is pop a collar on the top of the damper and fit an M3x20. But wait, there's a problem. I'm not sure if I didn't get an earlier step quite right, but if the damper collar is all the way up against the cross member, the damper's not going to be in line with the lower mount. You can almost force it, but that's not going to be a long-term solution. After a bit of fiddling about, I found if you install a half nut between the collar and the cross member, it all lines up perfectly. And now that it does all line up, we can pop a collar into the bottom of the damper and use an M3x12 and a flange nut to fit it to the lower mount of the axle. Oh, and if you want straight access to the screw heads at the top of the dampers, there's a somewhat convenient hole in the rear member. I would have used them, but from the angle I'm working at, I didn't even see them. Someone needs to invent an invisible camera. Actually, that's probably a bad idea. Couldn't be much simpler then, and with both installed, the suspension looks like it's going to work a treat. It almost went together as well as the Tamiya kits. As long as you've got some extra patience and some nuts, bolts and shims at hand, there's nothing that's too difficult to work around. And that brings us to the end of this week's exciting instalment. As always, thanks for watching, like if you liked, subscribe if you haven't, and do please leave a comment if you got something to say. Bye guys!